As I mentioned, transcultural psychiatry at McGill at the time had kind of shrunk down a bit. Originally, that program had started in the mid-1950s as a partnership between anthropology and psychiatry, Jack Fried in anthropology, and Eric Whitcower in psychiatry. And it had been driven by the suggestion by Ewan Cameron, who's become a somewhat notorious figure because of his CIA-funded mind control experiments, but he was the first president of the World Psychiatric Association. He had a lot of institutional authority and power and was interested in stimulating different kinds of activities, and so he encouraged this work in cultural psychiatry, which was motivated by the fact that there were very diverse trainees coming from all over the world, particularly because of the influence of the British Commonwealth. So people were coming from Hong Kong or from Singapore or from East Africa because McGill, Montreal, McGill, Canada, whatever is on their mental map, and it became a natural place to go for advanced training. So they took that opportunity to begin to start a discussion around cultural issues, to start a newsletter. They were connected to all the leading figures of the time, Margaret Mead, Georges Devereux. All these people were in conversation and taking part in these exchanges. And the particular interest was, again, in understanding cultural diversity and how it intersects with mental health, using the available tools, which were, I guess, rudimentary biological psychiatry, psychoanalysis, certain amount of sociological theory, and the contemporary anthropology of the time, which was still, I think, bearing a lot of traces of the culture and personality kinds of approaches of the 30s and 40s. And so that was the context in which Eric Whitcower and then Henry Murphy, who was really trained as a social psychiatrist and psychiatric epidemiologist, who'd worked in Singapore, worked for UNHCR, did an early book on called Flight and Resettlement, one of the first books on the mental health of refugees. But when he came to Quebec, he never took out a medical license and really just functioned as a researcher. And he became an important mentor for Ellen Corin, for others, and Ray Pritz, who I'll talk about it more later. So it was Henry Murphy at McGill, based at the Douglas Hospital at the time, who, with Guy Dubois, a psychological anthropologist, formed a kind of collaborative network called GERAM, which met, I don't know the earlier phases very well, but it met regularly for discussions and put on a series of conferences. And the conferences were very stimulating. They brought in people, Vincent Crampenzano, Alan Rowland, people who were working often at the intersection of psychology and anthropology, trying to understand cultural variation. Gilles Bibot became a very important figure in this process and kind of revitalizing GERAM, which had needed the energy, organizational energy, and kind of effort to keep it going. And he came to this with a more medical anthropological kind of approach. So Gilles and Hélène and Guy, for that matter, were very warm and welcoming to me as somebody who, again, was not a card-carrying anthropologist, but had been hanging around with a lot of people who were, at the forefront of contemporary work in medical and psychological anthropology. And they really treated me as one of the gang, and as somebody who, as a young, emerging, whatever scholar, could contribute in certain ways. So that was extremely formative for me. It's hard I'd have to look back at the timetable to see exactly what came first, but a couple of things were going on in parallel. So the experiences with GERAM were going on at the same time as I was beginning to try to engage a little bit with transcultural psychiatry at McGill, and coming at that through the work that I was doing at the hospital. So in 1981, I finished my training and came on at the Jewish General Hospital as a staff psychiatrist, but with a day and a half a week of research time protected. And the Jewish General Hospital was able to do that because the hospital foundation had money that it would use to support some research time for clinicians. And it also had a tradition. The psychiatry department had a research section that had a very strong tradition. Bill Eaton, a sociologist who was the principal investigator on the U.S. epidemiological catchment area studies, had an early phase of his career at the Jewish General Hospital. So it was kind of a plum job for somebody who wanted to be primarily a researcher, who didn't want to do any teaching and whatever. This was an attractive job. So they actually had a succession of very exceptional people kind of filling that role. When I came on in 1981, the head of the research section was John Siegel, who had trained with Anna Freud, who had, I think, had done part of maybe his PhD at UDM, and who was very interested in studying things like second and third generation Holocaust survivors and other kinds of important sort of things at the intersection of psychology and social processes. So I got a day and a half, a week of time to work on research, and I started doing some work on hypnosis, but around that time the Jewish hired a sociologist, Jim Robbins, who had trained with Jim Greenlee, who in turn had trained with David Mechanic, the sort of leading medical sociologist of the 70s, I guess, 70s, 80s. And so Jim was a quantitatively trained sociologist, and I was doing clinical work in consultation liaison psychiatry, which means I was seeing medical patients who had mental health issues and having to help negotiate the relationship between their physical symptoms and their psychological problems, social problems. And at the time, I remember when I was back at UC Davis in 1980, Byron Good had said to me, you need to go to the bookstore and get this book that just came out from my friend Arthur Kleinman. And that was a book called Patients and Healers in the Context of Culture, which really was the launching of a kind of renaissance or a new chapter in the sort of history of medical anthropology. Because it brought to bear more contemporary cognitive and social theories about illness behavior, illness cognition, and so on, to the phenomenon of help-seeking and depression and so on and so forth. So I'd been exposed to that, but Arthur Kleinman also wrote a paper in Social Science and Medicine in 1977 called Depression, Somatization, and the New Cross-Cultural Psychiatry. And the old cross-cultural psychiatry that he was sort of challenging was transcultural psychiatry at McGill. Because from his point of view, that was wedded to a kind of an old-fashioned kind of anthropology that tended to be somewhat universalistic, at least in the sense of saying, okay, psychoanalysis is a universal theory, will apply to everybody. Or, our view of biology is the only tool we need to make sense of what's going on. And instead he was arguing, and this went along with the whole turn in medical anthropology, that our own medical institutions are cultural constructions. And we need to see a certain symmetry between what patients and healers in their context are making, the way that they're making sense of things and the way that biomedicine makes sense of things. So Arthur Kleinman's work, along with Margaret Locke and Alan Young and so on, was looking a lot at biomedicine as a cultural institution. So that was part of the turn. And Arthur launched a journal, Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry. Anyway, I'm just giving you this bit of background because for me, when I read his paper, in which he, on the one hand, he's critiquing the McGill's kind of this tradition to some degree, but he's using the example of depression in China, and he's arguing that Asians and Chinese are prone to somatize because of cultural differences. Somatize meaning express emotional suffering or psychological conflicts in bodily symptoms. And when I read that as a clinician working in the hospital with patients, I was very puzzled because I thought, that's not something Chinese do, that's something everybody does. That's like every day in the hospital that you see people who are stressed and who are whatever, and they have stomach aches and headaches and whatever, and there's clearly some relationship there. You don't have to call everything psychosomatic to say that stress has a relationship. So it was odd to me that this we presented as though this is something special. So I went on with Jim. So Jim Robbins was a sociologist who was coming at things in a using the model that came out of David Mechanic and others of illness behavior. The idea that, look, people have symptoms, they get sick, they act certain ways, and those are based on what they believe and what's available, and cognitive and social factors. So we developed a cognitive social model of somatization, and we began working on this. And at that point, Jim said to me, well, we should go visit Arthur Barsky, who is a psychiatrist working a lot on illness behavior and somatization at Harvard. And I said, oh, that's cool. Okay, well, I think I'd like to try to visit Arthur Kleinman. And I have to say that, again, for me, having never gone to graduate school, notwithstanding what I said about having friendships and conversations with Margaret Locke and Byron Good and so on, I didn't really understand how academia works and how publishing works or how any of that. So for me, the idea that this person who wrote this book is a person you can actually go visit, you could say, I like your book, I'd like to come chat with you, was just totally novel idea. And that came from Jim, and he said, so we got in the car and we drove to Boston. And I went to Arthur Kleinman's office and arranged an appointment, and I came in and he was writing a letter to me. He had been writing a letter to me based on the first article that I published in Transcultural Psychiatry on somatization. And so thanking me for the letter and how useful it was. And there's a little footnote in one of his later books sort of referring to that. So that was a very, again, important moment for me of mentorship, of acknowledgement, of support. But I have to backtrack a bit because I'm tracing things, I'm not doing it very linearly. So what I should say is, before I go back to Jérôme, what I should say about this particular first piece of work on somatization, and I won't go too far into it because we'll talk about it separately as a topic. So let me just do this more biographically for the moment, was that I had been working on this this review article kind of based on thinking about my clinical work and the ways that we're trying to make sense of this in everyday experiences of patients in Montreal and the Côte-de-Neige, diverse people, including upper middle class people, Euro-Canadians, very highly educated, and people from all over, and pointing out that there were similarities that many people expressed their suffering in bodily symptoms. And I actually worked on that paper in Japan, because I'd gone to try to do field work in Japan. So, and that came out of the idea that, well, if I want to do this cultural work, I have to have some field experience. So where am I going to do that? Well, because Margaret worked in Japan, and Margaret had gone back to work in Japan, I thought this is a great opportunity. So I took a course in Japanese at McGill this is while I was working as a psychiatrist, so it's not easy, and I didn't have a lot of energy at the end of the day to go sit in language classes in Japanese, so I can't say I made very much progress. But anyway, I was trying. I did that, and then I went to Japan for a month or 5-6 weeks to Kyoto, where Margaret was working, and I stayed in a small temple run by a guy who drove a taxi in the daytime and was a priest and did ceremonies at other times, in the Nishijin area of Kyoto, which is like what we would say in Montreal, the Shimata district, the textile district. And that was a very strange and disorienting experience. That was my experience of culture shock, if you will. Because, well, I'll encapsulate that with one clear example. First of all, I did not speak much Japanese at all. I spoke just enough with just a good enough accent to give people the illusion that they could talk to me in Japanese, which of course then led to complete mystification. It's like you learn a little bit of guidebook Japanese, and if you don't have a bad accent, then people think they can actually respond to you, and then it was hopeless. But I had a couple of experiences in Japan during that time that were really challenging. One was I went to Fushimi Inari, to this famous temple shrine, where the whole mountain really covered with all these torii gates and so on. A beautiful photograph of that I can show you, and actually I have a photograph on the wall here from there. And I tried to buy something from a vendor at the base, a little sparrow on a stick, and I said in my best Japanese, can I have one of those little birds? And the guy said, in Japanese enough that I could understand. Daughter, come here and talk to the gaijin. Come and talk to the foreigner. So that moment of being treated like you're really a foreigner, you're really a stranger, you're really a problem, was very disturbing. And the other thing that was more at a visceral level was the little temple that I was staying in. I came with a free ticket to the public bath. So every evening before dinner, I would get in my yukata, like a little skimpy robe, and put on a gaita, little sort of wooden shoes, which barely fit or slippers, I think, not even gaita, slippers, that didn't really fit my feet because my feet were too big, and walk down the public street from the little otera, the temple, to the bath. And at the bath, a little lady would take my ticket, and it would have male and female sides, which was a modern thing. It used to be not so separated. And I went and had to take off my clothes and shower and get in a tub and so on. And the whole while, the little lady is looking and watching me because I'm this very hairy guy, and in their mind, I look like an Ainu, an indigenous person from the north, not a normal person from. So that was, again, another experience of feeling very odd, and that repeated itself many times, of feeling, getting on the train or this, and feeling like I was taking up way too much space because, people. Or going to a club of a psychiatrist who invited us to his private club and sitting in his tiny room drinking whiskey while a karaoke singer makes fun of my accent. So all kinds of very strange moments like that. Anyway, the point is during that time that I wrote this first article on somatization, sitting in a hotel room and working on this paper. And when I came back, I got a nice letter from Eric Whitcower, who is still alive, although ill, thanking me for a contribution to the journal. So that was one strand of my gradually getting involved with cultural psychiatry at McGill, and that went on in parallel with this engagement with Jérôme, where there were all these psychological anthropologists being invited to come and talk, and we were having these really rich discussions and getting exposed to variety of perspectives. And Jérôme had a journal at the time called Santé, Culture, Health, which was languishing, and so I took on the job of co-editing it with Guy Dubreuil as a bilingual journal, which I have the copies here somewhere. It only lasted a brief period of time. I think a bilingual journal is a hard sell. People don't, people are more comfortable with one or the other. You can't satisfy everybody with the joint one. But it was, again, very emblematic of the dynamics of Jérôme and what it aspired to do. So this kind of brings us up to the point where in the 80s I was working at McGill, at the Jewish General Hospital, not at McGill. Jewish is one of McGill's 5 main teaching hospitals. I was working there, doing clinical work in consultation liaison psychiatry, working with as a consultant to the dialysis unit with people on dialysis. Working in behavioral medicine clinic with people in family medicine, doing research on somatization in primary care, trying to understand, the fact that most people with depression present with physical symptoms. What does that tell us? How does that intersect? Using sociological and cognitive approaches to try to make sense of that. And then an opportunity, let me get the timing of this right. Yeah, probably I should... I'll have to check the dates to put it in the right order. But the approach that we were taking to sort of illness behavior and illness cognition, to think about somatization, really was situated between sociological, psychological, and to some extent anthropological perspectives. And so we were able to get some funding. I say we, me and Jim Robinson, were able to get some funding for kind of a research program that would pursue some of those topics in more depth. And that was sort of the kinds of activities in the 80s that I was involved with until the late 80s, when I had the opportunity to work up north. And again, I was concerned because the experience in Japan was interesting. I mentioned I was trying to find a way to do some field work, and I took advantage of the fact that Margaret Log was there. I was able to have some nice connections. I went with her, for example, to visit the psychiatry residents at Kyoto University, and she was working on a paper at the time on school refusal, and so we listened to their reflections, and that was quite helpful. Subsequently, I went back to Japan many times, 8 or 9, 10 times I've been back to Japan and been, had students and postdocs and other people who've come. But I realized at that time that I was not going to be able to master Japanese to the degree that I would really be able to do anything meaningful in terms of field work. Plus, I was working as a clinician, and I started having a young family, and it did not seem very, although I remember when my wife was pregnant, we both were taking Japanese lessons at the time from Chris Honda, Margaret's main Japanese teacher, who had come back and was in Montreal. But again, it didn't seem realistic. So I was sort of in the back of my mind thinking, well, how am I going to do something more ethnographic, more cross-cultural? And then the opportunity arose. Michael Malice, who's a family physician at the Jewish General Hospital, who worked a lot with youth, was working as a consultant in the north in Nunavik, in Pavungatuk. And he contacted me and said, I know you're interested in cultural issues. We really need a psychiatric consultant in the north. There's been nobody there. We have family doctors, and we're having different specialists come up. We really could use a psychiatrist. So I thought this was a very interesting opportunity, and I agreed to go up. And so I guess it's around 1989 that I started going up. And for a period of 3 or 4 years, I went up 3 or 4 times a year, a week to 10 days each time, to work in the north and do consultations. So that was an amazing experience. The first time I flew to the north, on a twin-engine, plane. Once you got up to Kujuarapik, then you were on small planes, and it cost. First of all, it cost as much as it would cost to go to Japan to fly to the north. So that already made it seem pretty far. And then the reality is, once you land, you're in a totally different world, and that was very profound for me. And what was interesting was I had a legitimate reason for being there. In other words, I was there as a helper, and people wanted my, my psychiatric consultation skills at the same time as I was in a totally different milieu and could really reflect on what was going on. So that was fulfilling a certain need to begin to, decenter and think about what mental health looks like in different environments. But the other thing that happened, and we'll talk about this more, is that I was asked to see patients. And I saw one young person after another who'd made a suicide attempt. So seeing so many young people who had made suicide attempts just really impressed on me the sense that this is not an individual problem. Thinking about this purely individually is missing the point. There's a whole cohort of young people being affected, and we have to come at this a different way. So that led to a whole long line of research and work that I'll talk about in more detail later. So that has started at that time. And then the next, I guess I'll end this chapter with the next sort of turning point, which was Ray Prince, who was the third of the triumvirate of main people involved with cultural psychiatry here, had decided to retire. And he had a McGill position, even though he was based at another service, and said he wasn't going to retire until they hired somebody to continue cultural psychiatry at McGill. So he very, we could say skillfully in terms of academic politics, managed to leverage that, and they announced a search for this position. And I have generally not been a very self-promoting person. I don't like whatever sort of the stuff you have to do to promote yourself. But I realized that this was the perfect job for me, that I really wanted this job. So I lobbied heavily for this job. I spoke to Margaret and Alan Young and other people, and I got them all to write letters, and I lobbied hard for this job. And I got this job in 1991. So that for me was a very significant turning point. I had at this point the hospital was supporting me a day and a half, 2 days a week in research. I made an arrangement that the hospital would pay that part of my salary to McGill, so that combined with the salary from McGill, I would be getting a regular salary from McGill rather than part from McGill, part from the hospital. So that identified me as a full-time academic. and in effect put, at the time, and these things have changed a lot, but it put me in effect on a kind of tenure track. And when I took over from Ray Prince, this division was really just him and Nancy Fraser-Smith, a sociologist who studied heart disease, and Françoise Cheng-Laroche. So it had shrunk down to that. The journal, which had become Transcultural Psychiatric Research Review, was largely written by Ray and desktop published here. So my mandate from the department when I took over from the chair, it was Gilbert Pinard at the time, was to make the journal into a peer-reviewed journal, because it was hard for the university to justify somebody devoting a lot of time to something that was really a journal of précis and reviews and so on, and to revitalize the section in transcultural psychiatry. So that's what we set about doing. And really have created, I think, an environment that is extremely warm and supportive, that had strong anthropological connections to Margaret Locke, to Alan Young, to Ellen Corin, and others, and that has continued to flourish really without a huge amount of institutional support, but really through networking people with common interests.